Welcome back to the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast, a podcast dedicated to reintroducing personal narratives into critical public health topics. On today's episode, my conversation with Dr. Taylor Winkleman. Once upon a time, Dr. Winkleman was a high school student who did not know what she wanted to do with the rest of her life. She decided to join the Army, and as fate would have it, her first day of basic training was September 11th, 2001. She learned Arabic and worked as a linguist in the Army. Afterwards, she returned to school, getting an MPH and a DVM. Dr. Winkleman then took her passion and education in public health, global health, and animal health into the service of global health and health policy. She now works as a consultant for major organizations that you may have heard of, such as the WHO. She also works as an adjunct professor of science policy at Georgetown University, which is where I met her. This conversation covers many critical topics in public health, like veterans' health, which Dr. Winkleman has a lot of personal experience with. We also cover one of my favorite topics, which is what each of us can do with our one wild and precious life. So if you're wondering what to do next with your life, or you enjoy critical topics in public health, then you are sure to love my conversation with Dr. Taylor Winkleman. So Taylor, Dr. W.
Marian,
welcome to the podcast.
thank you for having me. It's fun to be here.
I'm very excited to have you here. I really just want to start way back in the way back.
Okay.
Let's take it all the way back. Something I love to hear about is, especially with people like yourself who have careers where as a child you wouldn't have heard of this career. You know, it's not like I want to be a librarian, a doctor, a lawyer. It's like this is not a job that a little kid could have picked out of a hat. So I love to hear about the journey from I was a kid, I had this vision for my future, there was a winding path, I ended up here. So let's take it way back to the way back. What did little baby Taylor want to be when she grew up?
That is such a weird question for me because as a small baby Taylor, I wanted to be an artist or a writer or an astronaut. At one point, I think when I was 9, I said I wanted to be a teacher, and then I realized I didn't have any patience, and that was probably a bad idea. But by the time I was really thinking about the possibilities of a future, I didn't know. I had no idea what I wanted to be, and I felt very stuck and very unsure of what the future would even look like, and I started to doubt that there really was a future. I was a very angsty teen, very angsty teen.
Relatable.
Yeah. So as a small child, I wanted sort of what everybody wanted. I was very creative. I wanted to draw and paint and write and just do that for the rest of my life. And then I didn't. And that's kind of what happened.
Yeah. I love that you said that because we do spend an awful lot of time when kids are little asking them what they want to be when they grow up. And we do get these great answers like artist and astronaut. And then everyone kind of has that drift, I think, where it becomes much less clear. And everyone starts asking like, well, what do you really want to be? I mean, like, you're not going to be an astronaut. So like, what do you really want to be? And interestingly, you did kind of end up being a writer and a teacher and an astronaut. I mean, at least involved in science policy. So
Yes.
related.
Yes, and that really came from my father. He loved space, still loves space. I grew up with a telescope in my house. I grew up naming the constellations with my dad, and so stargazing was always just a thing, but I never pursued physics. Oh, I lied. I did want to be a physicist at one point. I wanted to be a theoretical physicist. I read Brian Greene's Fabric of the Cosmos and thought, oh, I'll do that. And then my dad took me and I met Michio Kaku when I was like 16. And I asked him what happens to a superstring in a black hole, and he glared at me because you can't answer that question. And it was in a room of like 150 or 500 people. It was a huge room at the California Academy of Sciences. And he just looked at me like, how dare you? So I did at one point want to be a scientist too. I never, as a teenager, as a young kid, I never really envisioned the steps that it would take to do any of those things. And I think it's important to know that it's okay to be directionless at some points in your life. You will be. And we're often sold a narrative that you always have to know what's next. And I don't think I've ever known what's next, with very few exceptions.
Yeah. I also agree that it's very important to highlight that. And I do have some listeners who are teenagers and who are on the cusp of a new beginning right now, graduating high school and heading off into the quote unquote real world, if you will. And so I want to speak a little bit about when you were in that phase of life. You were on the cusp of the next big adventure and you felt like maybe you didn't want to do what everyone else was doing. So walk me through that.
If there's one thing that defines my life, it's probably that. I don't want to do what everyone else is doing. I get frustrated when I feel like I'm just following the crowd or following some prescribed, this is what you're supposed to do. So I went to a public high school in California, but it was in a really, really, really upscale area. Like my family, which is solidly middle class, were the poor kids, which is a weird bubble to grow up in or to experience sort of those teen years in. But it also made for a strange, there wasn't a choice where I went to high school. Everybody went to college. Everybody went to college. The requirements to graduate that high school made sure you could get into a state school. If you graduated, you were going to college. 97% of the graduating class goes directly to a four-year college, which is unheard of. And of course, we didn't know that at the time, right? It's just what everybody did. And I can remember my older brother going to college and having a hard time and not really finding a rhythm. And that scared me because I didn't know what I wanted. How are you supposed to do something right if you don't know what the thing that you're trying to do is? So I did everything I was supposed to do. I applied to college. I got accepted to, I think, 4 or 5 of them. I picked one, said I was going to go. And then I just froze. I just didn't do anything. I didn't register for classes. I didn't make a plan for getting down there. It was in San Diego. I didn't do anything. And one day, my stepmom and I were driving home, and she stopped the car in the middle of the road, looked at me and said, "You don't want to go to college yet, do you?" And I said, "No, I don't." And I felt like I felt like a failure, right? I felt like I was letting everybody down. I felt like I was not doing what I was supposed to be doing, and somehow I was broken. And she didn't accuse me. She didn't look at me like, "How dare you?" or "You're disappointing," or any of that. She just said, "Well, then why don't you join the military while you figure it out?" And I opened my mouth to give her, a very teen angsty list of why not, and I couldn't come up with anything. And I just said, "Oh, okay." And that was really it. I went to a recruiter. I talked to him for 6 hours. I, did all the things, but really that was the moment that my mind was made up. I just very abruptly turned and did nothing that anybody else would have expected. When the word got out, I was not the most athletic teen. When the word got out, people came up to me telling me I was going to fail. And you've known me for a while, and you know that I'm driven by spite. And so the feeling of like, fuck you, watch this, is pretty much how I've lived my entire life. And the more that people told me, "You're not going to make it," the more I was like, go fuck yourself. You don't tell me what to do. And that was really it. I joined the military. I signed up for 6 years. And because my baby brother and sister, whose birthday is next week, were 2 at the time, I signed up to be a linguist because language school was about 45 minutes from my parents' house. And that's all the thought I put into my entire future, which I don't necessarily recommend, but it worked out for me. But yeah, that's what I did. I went to language school because I wanted to see my brother and sister enough. And I joined in early 2000 or June of 2001, and I signed up for basic training, shipping out on September 11th, 2001. So that sort of defined the next 6 years of my life.
Absolutely. And what a day to ship out.
Didn't ship out, as you might have guessed.
You'll never forget that day. So hearing that story, which thank you for sharing it, by the way, because I've heard versions of it from being in your class, but but not with so much detail. And I love the part about wanting to be home near the baby siblings because I can really relate to that. I mean, especially as a mom, I've made a lot of choices in my life based around, okay, well, I want this and I want that. Which one is going to be better for my kids?
Yeah.
And so you sort of had that as well, just like which is going to allow me to see these babies. So very relatable from where I'm sitting. And then also, it's funny because when I was in high school, I also very much had that personality of like, I don't want to do what everyone else is doing. I don't want to do what's expected of me. So I became a teen mom, which is another way to say go fuck yourself to everyone else's standards.
Sure is.
But it really is. But I was intrigued by the military recruiters at my school, and I would hang out with them, and people said the same thing to me, which is like, have you met yourself? You hate authority. What business would you have in the military? You would hate it. So I am curious because obviously I can relate to like, oh, you think I can't? Well, watch me. But like, I feel like our personalities are similar enough that that authority part, the people weren't wrong. Like I would have been incredibly difficult and struggled with anyone having this ultimate power over me. So what was that like? Like, how did you adapt to that?
It helped that I was 17.
Mhm.
And it helped that for all of the amazing things that my parents were and are, they were very strict, and my parents have, especially my mom, have very strong personalities that you have to contend with to try and stand up and stand out and be heard and all of that, which honestly I credit for um a lot of things that have been successful in my life. But for me, basic training was the easiest thing in the world. And people who've been in the military are screaming right now because that's not what it's designed to be. It's not designed to be easy. But if you've seen Forrest Gump and Forrest Gump says to the drill sergeant, whatever you tell me to, drill sergeant, that's what you do, right? These are people who have authority over you, but it's not personal.
Right.
Nobody's there looking at me going, well, you suck. And so I'm going to make your life miserable, which when you're a teenager looking at your parents, it is very natural to look at your parents who are trying to shape, you and your world and your life and your future for your best interest. It's still very normal to look at your parents and be like, why do you hate me so much? Why are you ruining my life? Nobody was trying to do that. So basic training for me was very simple. You get up when you're supposed to get up or earlier. You do what you're supposed to do as best you can. And you try to help everybody else around you. And you get to do cool shit. You get to play on obstacle courses. You get to go target shooting. You get to hike through the woods, and some of it's not fun. But, it's a time to explore who you are. And I think at 17, 18 years old, there's a lot of liberation in that, in finding out that you're not who you thought you were. You're not what everybody else defined you as, right? They defined me as unathletic, as nerdy, as dorky, as incapable of doing this thing. And so for me, that whole spite, fuck you part was focused on watch me do this better than anybody else has ever done it. And it builds a lot of respect for the chain of command, of respect for hierarchy, of understanding if you're going to say no to somebody, there are consequences. And I hesitate to call the military or college or the professional world like the real world compared to high school or something. But you learn that there is a reason for the authority, right? Like you might go into combat, and it was, of course, very real in September of 2001. You might go into combat, and when you're in combat, it makes perfect sense to follow an order immediately because that's how people survive. And if you don't follow orders immediately, you could get people killed. And so that being the case, it makes sense. And when rules make sense, I have no problem following them. That doesn't mean that I was a perfect soldier. And it doesn't mean that I didn't break ranks or disobey direct orders or do things that I knew would get me in trouble. I just did them with the full knowledge that if I did them, I was going to face consequences, and I'd better have a damn good reason. So it really helped me to sort of solidify my moral core and help me understand that telling people to fuck off for the sake of it is not helpful, but being willing to stand up for the right thing is always the right thing to do, no matter the consequence.
Yeah. Gosh, there's so many things that you've said in the last few minutes that I'm like, I want to ask about that. I want to quote that back to you, but I think I have to just sort of continue forward with hearing you speak. It's making me think about just public service in general, right? Obviously, the military, to some extent, is a form of public service. And, what the thing that you were just saying about when you're 17, 18, getting to know yourself, realizing that maybe you're not who you thought you were, that you're not who others thought you were, and how powerful that is. There is sort of this conveyor belt that takes kids and pushes them towards teenagehood and pushes them towards college, generally speaking. Not everywhere in the world, but currently in our society, that's kind of the path that everyone's on. And as someone who walked a winding path, I've always been very like, you don't have to do that. There's other ways, but the other ways aren't as obvious and they aren't as offered. The opportunity
Right.
to choose another path is not as clear, especially if you're someone who maybe, for whatever reason, would not be interested in the military.
Mm.
So, for someone listening, or anyone who is sort of curious about, this does sound nice, like exploring myself, getting to know myself, not going right to college, but isn't necessarily military bound. Are there any other paths that you might offer in terms of service? Like, have you met along your journey people who had similar developmental experiences, but on an alternate route?
I mean, I think almost any life experience becomes that, right? And there's a recognition of you are who you want to be. Ultimately, once you get past your formative years, the responsibility ends up being yours of who you want to be, whether you want to be like your parents or not. And you'll find yourself reacting in the way that your parents would. And then you get to choose, like, do I still want to do this? Or am I willing to take a look at myself and say, I'm not what I want to be and I want to change it? And I don't know that the military is the single and only place that you can do things like that. I think you have to get through college to join the Peace Corps.
I think so also. And I had a
Um,
guest a couple weeks ago who was a Peace Corps member who very much said it was a
um,
huge development thing for him.
yeah, but I've met a lot of people who were LDS members who, they would go on mission. Several of them got excommunicated. Excommunicated members of LDS tend to join the military, apparently.
Interesting.
Well, they tend to become linguists because often LDS people will go to a
Right.
foreign country and they will learn that language and then they'll come into the army after they get excommunicated, which honestly, every single excommunicated LDS member I've met has been a badass. They've been really fun. But I think, anytime that you're going to go out and be independent, I'm going to go get a job. I'm going to go hike the Adirondacks or the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Crest Trail, or I'm going to go backpack for a year. I had a friend who did something called woofing,
Mm-hmm.
which is, I don't remember what it stands for, but it's basically being an itinerant farm worker around the world,
Yeah.
which I think you'd probably either need to have money saved up or support because it doesn't pay well. But I had friends who did that. Getting away from where you grew up is usually all you're really going to need to do. I think even if you end up going back home and staying there, getting out of the routine and the place where everybody has defined you for you and realizing that you get to choose is really all that's necessary. If anybody is interested in joining the military, I'm talking to you kids, put a lot more thought into it. Be very careful because once you do sign, you're in. And there is no getting out early with honor unless you get hurt, and you don't want to get hurt like that. That's not a good way out. So just understand that you are making a commitment that you can't break easily and that will affect you positively or negatively for the rest of your life. And so you have to obey the rules or decide that you're willing to take the consequences of not. So that's a pretty extreme way of going to find yourself. Maybe, go backpacking instead. Like maybe that.
Okay. Yeah.
Just a
I
thought.
like that. I like backpacking. And of course, there are so many ways to learn and explore and discover.
Yeah.
college being one of them, right? Depending on how
Yes.
you do it. Absolutely. Okay. So I think this is probably sort of an obvious question,
Mhm.
but you now work in a space where you're thinking about global issues on a daily basis. And you were in the military, also facing in person, firsthand, big, messy, complicated global issues. So I am curious how your experience in the military and what you saw and what you did and who you had to learn to be and all of those things, people you met, how that informs your view of global issues today.
Oh, it might be an obvious question, but it's a complicated question. Um, so I was a linguist. I went to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey and I learned Arabic, and that's a 63-week program. It's really hard. Um, but you get taught by native speakers. And the military is about, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, it's about being as patriotic and as sort of focused on the good of your country as possible. But when you're learning a language and you're forming relationships with people who are teaching you those languages and you are seeing the decency and the kindness and the goodness in them, and you are learning a language, which means necessarily learning a culture because culture and language shape each other, you can't really help but start to have your worldview expanded. And so when I deployed, I found myself in a very different position than I think a lot of my fellow soldiers, because a lot of my fellow soldiers were focused on winning the war, killing the enemy. And I was focused so much more on the people who were being, who were not non-combatants is the term, but people who couldn't leave. I was in Baghdad in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom 2, so 2004, 2005. And most people just wanted to be able to live. Most people were not there trying to hurt me or anybody else. They just wanted to live and they were in an impossible situation. And so I walked into that situation wanting to make things better, not wanting to hurt anybody. Um, and it was just a difficult experience in that because you have to protect the people around you and you have to focus on that because people are shooting at you. Um, but I think I had a different worldview simply because I did language school and because I responded to that just as much, if not more so, than my military training. And so I'm not a person who's like easily propagandized. I'm usually a person who asks why an annoying number of times. So for me, it's sort of cliche to say it was my boots on the ground experience, but I had a very up close view of what it was like when the water main got attacked and people didn't have access to clean water. And we were using water bottles, right, to take showers and just all sorts of things. What happens when basic services go down? And I just remember always sitting there going, can't we make this better? Can't we, like, we're the richest, most powerful, most logistically capable military in the world. Can't we make it better? Can't we do better than this? As it turns out, we could. And we did. And there was a huge shift in policy in about 2007 that was the result of a lot of soldiers saying the same thing that I was saying. So I think a lot of us, when we're faced with situations like that, we end up recognizing the humanity in everybody and recognizing that a lot of people are just in impossible situations and trying to survive.
Yeah. Something that I asked another guest recently, because I think this is very relevant to all of us right now in our current world. The world feels crazy. It's all anyone really ever says is just how chaotic the world feels. And yes, we can zoom out and say it was probably crazier during this time period. It might have felt crazier during this time period, but those people didn't have the internet constantly telling them how crazy it was. So I feel like it's really in our faces. And so, obviously you've had this experience, very formative, of being really in it, being in a true crazy battlefield, minute to minute, surviving, figuring it out, wanting to make it better. But zooming out a little bit from that, like, what do you think the average person can do right now, day to day, to just feel at all like they could or might make a difference, right? Like, is there any daily habit, task, activity, routine, something? I mean, you're working in global policy,
Yeah.
so obviously you've chosen, and we're going to go more into that. I keep sort of flirting with it, hinting at it, but we are going to go there. But, again, like this question just keeps coming up. Like for the average person who just wakes up and goes, wow, I feel overwhelmed by how crazy the world feels these days. Speaking as someone who's been in the thick of it, do you have any tips for how to process those feelings, or what might one do to move through them?
Read Tolkien, honestly. So I was an English major in college, in addition to science and all of that. And for me, having been in the military, reading Tolkien as an adult was very different than reading Tolkien as a teen. Reading Tolkien as a teen was very much, ooh, fantasy, ooh, swords, ooh, cool stuff. Reading it as someone who had been in a war and knowing that Tolkien wrote that after his war experience. In fact, he wrote at one point in his life, he wrote, by 1918, all but one of my close friends were dead. And there's a great book for anybody who's interested. It's called Tolkien and the Great War, that really, really helps you understand sort of Tolkien's point of view. But he wrote that book about, quote unquote, the average person. He wrote that book about hobbits whose lives were described as small and pastoral and just focused on food. And Tolkien also wrote the world would be a far better place if people valued food and music above, swords and hoarded gold, or power and hoarded gold, something like that. He wrote to celebrate that point of view. He wrote to exalt what that is about. And he also wrote very specifically, even the smallest person can change the course of the future. And I am easily overwhelmed by the massive amount of work that has to be done and the things that need to be done to make the world a better place. But I also think that if you focus on one thing that matters to you, one thing that you care about, you're the only person with your perspective. I am the only person in the world with my specific perspective that has done my specific path. So I have things that are specifically for me to do. And if I am willing to have the courage to fight for those and to go after those, and I am willing to let other people pick up the things that they are passionate about, like you with food as medicine, I sleep better at night knowing that you're doing that, right? I am fortunate that I teach a lot of students and I get to see all the different things that they care about, and I get to hear about all the things that they're working on. So I think the other thing to think about is there was not one hobbit, right? There were 4. And they always had a companion. There was always someone that they were with. They were never alone. And that's really what this is. Even if you feel like you're fighting alone for something that you care about, you're not. You're not the only person thinking it. You're not the only person working on it. And if you're willing to keep looking, you will find the people that are working on what you're working on and that will support you and that you can support.
So I'm not going to cry, but I almost did.
No.
And you've officially broken me, because I have one of my stubborn streaks in high school, being that girl that was like, I don't do what you do, is that I refused to ever get into Lord of the Rings. I was like, everyone loves Lord of the Rings, so I think it's trash. Not really, but like, I just don't, I'm never going to read it. I don't care. But you have now broken me.
Oh.
And I really, especially because I also in high school did not like history. I have a lot of like adult passions that when I was younger, I just like for some reason decided they were not for me. So hear that, kids. Like, you just never know when you might change your mind. I used to be a vegan. Now I'm like, is my farmer coming with my, cow that he himself killed? Will he be here soon? But I also in high school did not like history. And now I love history. And I love World War I. And so this knowing that there is a book about Tolkien and World War I, and you get to learn about how World War I impacted,
Yeah.
You have moved me, and I am forever changed. So let the record show that I'm now open to reading Lord of the Rings.
Uh-oh.
But I think I might read that book first because I think I need the history hook to get me into it
That's fair.
because I'm that kind of a nerd.
That's fair.
But that did really move me because I do think, speaking as someone who is very passionate and has these things that I really want to fix and change the world, you do sometimes feel alone. You feel like, how can one person possibly do this? Like I often will go, like I was in DC a couple nights ago and I looked around and I was like, God, there's so many people. There's just so many of us. Like, what? How can one person do anything? There's so many. And this is DC. We aren't even that crowded. Like, we're not New York. We're not any city in India. Like, we're just DC. And so I feel often that powerlessness that comes with knowing just the volume of issues. But it is so good to hear and to be reminded. And as you mentioned, as a professor, to see like the next generation coming up and coming through, that there are a lot of passionate people and they are working on these issues. And like, I'm passionate about food as medicine and the microbiome. But those things are dependent on, let's say, the functioning of agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
I care about that, but I don't have the time to be a specialist in that. But luckily, there are people who, for as many years as I've cared about the food I'm putting in my mouth, have cared about soil quality.
Yep.
And they're doing that work. So part of what I love is everything that you just said, which is just like staying focused on that. There are so many people, they are doing the work. But I also love to just like examine the places where those people come together and end up touching the issues all rub up against each other. Here I am rubbing my hands. And one of the places where that happens, of course, is in the policy space. So I want to transition a bit over to the work that you do. Although to get there, let's just quickly you were an English major.
Yep.
But then you became a doctor of veterinary medicine. So
that was actually the plan. So for all of you children who have wanted to be a veterinarian since you were 3 years old.
And that's every single one.
That's 99% of people who go to vet school. Please understand that veterinary medicine is not what you think it is. And please go talk to a lot of veterinarians before you make a decision for the rest of your life, because becoming a veterinarian will shape what you do. And there are a lot of possibilities for it. But the field will push you towards clinical medicine or towards a residency in pathology or radiology or something like that. And if that's not going to be for you, you're going to feel a lot of pressure to not break away from the herd. However, to get there, by the time I finished up my military service, I knew I wanted to be a veterinarian. I had made the decision, and I made it about as quickly as I made the decision to join the military. So I started doing some research and realized it's really hard to get into vet school, and it continues to be really hard to get into vet school. And so I knew that I needed to differentiate myself and set myself out. And I also know, although I had not yet been diagnosed with ADHD, that my particular brand of neurospiciness requires me to be overloaded, which is not a life plan. Everybody, please don't follow that. But I knew how to manage myself, and I knew how I would be most energized and how I would stick with science, because I was not originally inclined towards science. I loved physics and I loved astronomy, but I was not originally, I never envisioned myself becoming a scientist. So I said, I'm going to double major. I'm going to major in biology and I'm going to major in English. And that English degree is going to set me apart from all of the biology majors that are applying. I'm going to do every study abroad I can find. I did 7. None of them were semesters. They were all like weeks or 2 weeks or something like that. I did 7. It was awesome. And I'm going to do research, and I'm going to do literally everything I can. I did much more than I needed to. But I did the English major for myself. I've always loved literature. I've always loved books and reading, and it got me through my childhood. And I wanted to continue to do that because nobody was going to tell me that I couldn't love books, and nobody was going to tell me that I couldn't earn a piece of paper that said that I loved books. So I did that on purpose. I did actually a creative writing major, and then I learned that I should have been a chemistry major. As it turns out, I had amazing biology and chemistry professors, but I did my undergrad thesis in chemistry. Um, then I did an internship at MD Anderson in cancer research. So I basically lumped everything I possibly could into 4 years before I went to vet school to guarantee that I'd get in on the first try, because a lot of people don't. But it was actually this was the only time in my life that everything was directed the whole time. I knew where I was going, which is the other gift of having joined the military first and then realizing I need a direction and getting one, because I'd started fostering animals and realized I was really good with them. I have puppy magic, which most veterinarians have. Like, the animals in the room just drift to you. And yeah, so I had decided I wanted to be a veterinarian. And by the time I realized that clinical veterinary medicine and I were not simpatico, I was already in vet school. So I had to figure it out from there.
And you do use your degree.
Yes.
Just in
Yes, I do.
ways you never could have imagined. So you ended up as a science fellow. Can you
Yes.
talk about what that is?
Yes. So the Association for the Advancement of American Science, better known as AAAS, has a fellowship program that puts scientists, veterinarians, and engineers with, I think it's 10 plus years of experience, into the federal government. And they go into all three branches. In Congress, you are sponsored by either AAAS, I think they'd still do 2 fellows a year, or a professional organization, and mine was the American Veterinary Medical Association. So I applied through the American Veterinary Medical Association. Other groups that do it are, I think, the American Society of Microbiology, the Geophysical Union. There's a whole bunch of them. There are usually 35 congressional fellows a year. I applied for it, and I had known I'd wanted to do it because I took a master's while I was doing my DVM in public health policy, and I essentially discovered it through my internship and through that. So I'm trying to make a long story very short. But so I had met some fellows, realized I wanted to do it, and my original goal was to go to the State Department because I wanted to travel, I wanted to work internationally, and the State Department seemed like a good way to get there. But because I was in vet school, I couldn't apply until I'd been out over a year. You have to have a degree in hand to apply for the executive branch fellowship. However, that's not the case for the congressional on the AVMA side, because AVMA understands if you're supposed to graduate in May, you will. It's not like getting a PhD. DVM is on schedule. So I could apply while I was still in school. I was living abroad at the time. I was working in Uganda and New Zealand while I was applying, which made turning everything in on time very scary because the time change is extreme. But I did my application while I was living abroad, and I had my interview, I think, a week after I got back to the States. So about a week and a half after I graduated from vet school, I had my interview. Flew up to DC from where I was staying with a friend in North Carolina, had the interview, and basically it felt like applying to vet school again because I had known I'd wanted to do it for 2 or 3 years, and I had shaped my experiences as much as I could to fit it. I was like, listen, I have a policy degree. Please tell me how many veterinarians are applying here with a policy degree. And I found out later, only 13 applicants for 3 spots. So I also managed to get the odds stacked in my favor that way. And I got the fellowship. And I knew I wanted to work in foreign policy. I knew I wanted to work in global health because I'd been involved in the global health security agenda since it started in 2014. And I knew that I wanted the freedom to add more things to my portfolio over time. It took a long time to find my office because of that. A lot of offices will offer to people with MPHs the medical or health portfolio that involves domestic health. That was the time that the ACA was in huge contention. In fact, that was the year that John McCain did the famous thumbs down. But I was terrified of working on the ACA because I didn't see it going anywhere. I saw it being deadlocked. And so I held out, and then I met my boss, my now old boss from Ed Markey's office, and I knew within 30 seconds that I wanted to work there. And it was done. I was done, and I basically thought, if I don't get into this office, I'm so screwed. But it worked out, and I went to Ed Markey's office and worked there for a year, and it was one of the most important years of my career. I think, ultimately. It was incredible. I got to work on everything I wanted to work on. I had the most amazing team, literally the most amazing team. And I have to sort of give them a shout out. Phil, Gene, Mark, Matthew. But that team was incredible. We had unbelievable interns. We just had an amazing team across the board who were all supportive, and it's one of the best work environments I've ever been in. You will not hear a lot of people who've worked on the Hill say that, but Ed Markey runs his office beautifully. It's a wonderful place to work, and I got to do everything I wanted to do. It was incredible.
Including, I know this from Inside Baseball, Inside Tips, space policy.
I did get to work in space policy. I got to meet several NASA administrators, and one of them invited my father to a rocket launch, which was the coolest thing, the coolest phone call I've ever made.
So you're not an astronaut, but you do play one on TV. Okay, so that's amazing. And that now, very, very quickly, very rapid, there goes like a decade, we did it. And here we are now to the work that you're doing today, which, of course, is how we met at Georgetown. You are a professor at Georgetown, but one of the many things that you do.
I'm an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown. I'm the lowest of the low rungs.
But importantly, there. And teaching science policy.
Yes.
So right at the intersection of all the things that you do and are passionate about. And again, able to see that next generation coming through, doe-eyed, curious, lost.
Much like you.
Scared, much like
not
me.
Not lost, not
terrified,
scared, but doe-eyed and beautiful.
Doe-eyed. Just staring into the lights. Help me. Help shape me and form me. But you do so much else. In fact, back in the day, a million years ago, 1 year ago, when I was in your classroom, you were often like coming to us live from Geneva, Switzerland.
That's true.
So you're doing the traveling that you hoped and dreamed for. So what are you up to these days?
People are not going to believe this when I say it out loud. Currently, semi-unemployed.
Nice.
I am currently on contract break from the World Health Organization.
She's open to work, folks. She's open
for like
to
the
work.
next week. So I'm a consultant at WHO, which I do not speak for, and I'm not currently doing at this particular moment. I'm on contract break. And if you would like to know more about that, just come out and buy me a drink and we'll talk. But I work on the UN's Biorisk Working Group, or I did while I was at WHO, and we are aiming at trying to reduce the impact of essentially human activity on causing pandemics, essentially. There's a bigger focus on bioterror in that one, on deliberate events, but it is attempting to coordinate the entirety of the UN's work on it, and it's attempting to coordinate how we interact with the outside world. And it's also attempting to figure out, how do we work on these things? How do we solve problems? How do we respond to problems? How do we get everybody to work on something when it costs money and effort and time? And all of those things are in short supply. And I don't know if anybody's paying attention to UN news, but the UN's in a financial crisis right now. Trying to do the pandemic treaty. They're trying to do the Pact of the Future. There's a lot going on at the UN. So I'm playing a very small part in that and working on that. I'm probably about to go work at UNIDIR, which is the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, for a few months. Last year, during my contract break, I worked at the World Food Program, and I wrote them a strategy for how to deal with biorisk. And so, I'm just sort of bouncing around in the international world right now. Never quite sure what's coming next, and never quite sure what we're going to be able to get done, because it's a hugely political job. You can't just do whatever you want. You have to work with all of your colleagues. You have to pay attention to what everybody else is working on. You have to care about what everybody else is working on, and see how best you can support, and how do you convince, for example, member states to care about what you're working on when they have very pressing issues. There are so many crises going on in the world right now. Multiple wars, multiple climate crises. Argentina is in a very bad way right now. They've got natural disasters. They've got a new president who is, I'm not sure about. And they've got massive inflation going on, which is really, really, like really a hugely bad crisis. And I think the UN just came out last week and said that 70% of Argentinian children are at risk for falling into poverty in the next year. So it's a lot. There's a lot happening, and there's a lot that we sort of have to be cognizant of at all times to try and work on these things. But you also try to be creative. So there's a team of like 3 of us at WHO that do this. There's a team over at the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs that we work with pretty closely. And then there are 30 UN entities that are involved in the virus working group. So it's a lot to try and pay attention to and work on. Yeah, that's what I do right now.
Do you ever get to use your linguist training?
I do. I more get to use it to learn French. My French is absolutely terrible, as my husband, who speaks fluent French, will tell you. But because I'm constantly, traveling in and out of other countries, I do have to figure out how to operate in those countries. And nobody looks at a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white woman in Switzerland and assumes that you're a tourist and don't know what you're doing. So, in fact, I think I get asked where the toilet is more often than anybody else I know.
That's awesome.
If I go to a public park, somebody's going to ask me where the toilet is. So maybe I just work as a tour guide now.
I think maybe you should. You have an unfulfilled potential as a Swiss tour guide.
All I can tell you is that it better be on the left. À la gauche.
She's ready. Put her in, coach. Well, now we know what your retirement job might be.
Yes.
In like 30 plus 40 years, we'll see you in Switzerland.
5 seconds.
In 2 minutes, we're going to find you in Switzerland. You're just like, fuck it. I'm out. The bathroom's on the left.
If it's not too bad.
You got to find your own way. Speaking of finding your own way, this whole conversation has been very interesting to me, and hopefully to our listeners as well, because I do think it's so important to highlight that everyone has their unique journey. And you said something at the very beginning that like I almost wanted to stop you and say it again, which was something like, how can you do something right if you don't know what you're doing? And I bring that line back now because that's kind of so much of international health and policy is like we're making it up. These are big, as they say, wicked problems, really complex issues that no one has solved before. It's not like, oh, let's look and see how the last person solved peace on earth. And once we see their example, we can follow that. You're writing the map as you walk down the path. So that is really the question of the day, and the question of teenagehood, which is how you first introduced it, which is like, how do you do something right when you don't know what you're doing? And I think I'm asking myself that now, right? In food policy, food is medicine. That is not a thing that people have done before. I mean, Socrates, I think, mentioned it a couple times. But formally, in modern medicine, it has not been tackled. So it's a thing that we're making up as we go. Yep. And we just hope that with the best intentions and by taking science-informed, data-rich, passionate, careful steps forward, that we do the best that we can as we're making it up. I do want to also step into this public health lens because I love public health. You love public health. We love public health. And I think that unfortunately, over the last few years, the pandemic, the first time anyone had ever heard of public health often was when COVID hit. And so there's some confusion around what public health is and isn't. And it often gets kind of a bad rap or like a non-personalized rap because people think, oh, public health, like that's just numbers and data, and they don't care about my experience as an individual. So I love to talk to individuals about their individual experiences of public health topics. And you have some very rich experience. In fact, many public health topics, right? You're a woman, women's health, great topic. But you're a veteran, and veterans' health is a really important topic. Veterans' mental health, veterans' physical health, preventative care for veterans, the VA. These are all very critical public health topics. So for a bit, I would love to hear you speak about your own personal experience as a woman, as a veteran, interacting with the healthcare system. And what is your view from the inside of maybe the challenges, maybe some of the successes, and perhaps what you hope might improve in the near term?
That is so tricky. So as a veteran, I have used. I'm extremely fortunate, right? I'm a disabled veteran, technically, not technically. I am. And so I have access to VA care, which is, I'm going to say the dirty word, kids. It's socialized medicine, otherwise known as single payer, right? And the payer is the government, which means thank you for paying your taxes because you in part support veterans' health. Um, and what's interesting to me is that it is a system that ultimately, of course, it has problems, and there are places that are worse than others, but it is constantly seeking improvement, and it is actually does work more often than not. Um, and it is a constantly evolving, constantly changing situation. Working in veterans health, as little of it as I have done, has been incredibly rewarding simply because of my personal experience. As a person who uses the VA and understands the ins and outs of it, and as a person who is in the military and therefore understands not every single soldier is exactly the same, but understands a generalized military mentality and outset, I understand a lot of what's happening and what people are trying to do versus what maybe we ought to do. So I'm actually going to go back to my time in the Senate, because this was an incredible experience and probably informed a lot of my approach to the rest of my career. Um, and kind of goes back to that, how does one person make a difference? So at the time, Cory Booker was doing a bill on something called bad paper discharges. And what that means is you got something that's non-honorable discharge, which means even if you would have been able to access VA care, you're not eligible for it, right? So again, kids, if you join the military,
Be good.
be good. Yeah, be good, but also just understand what's at stake. However, there was a huge push from a lot of veteran service organizations at the time to recognize that PTSD was underdiagnosed. It was so much more common than we thought it was, and that it it was in fact the cause of some bad paper discharges. So PTSD can manifest in a number of ways. I have it as well, and mine manifests essentially when it sounds or feels like something's being shot. It sounds like a mortar or a gunshot. Like I've in my worst reactions, I've gone catatonic, but most of the time I just have a huge adrenaline response, and it takes several hours for me to kind of come back down. I've had a few panic attacks, but generally I'm okay. It's okay, everybody. I'm okay. But a lot of people have disciplinary issues. They'll self-medicate with drugs or alcohol. They get very disillusioned. There's suicide problems. There's all kinds of problems. And so a lot of people ended up getting kicked out of the military for behavioral issues. And there was suddenly a recognition that maybe they should have actually been med boarded or gotten out medically, retired medically, because their issues were caused by military service and were combat related, which would make them eligible for VA care. So there was a push, and Senator Booker's office was putting up a bill that would require the VA to give veterans, with those kinds of discharges, access to a mental health screening that would potentially have if they were diagnosed and it was, judged by the VA, or the military to be valid, that they would be able to have their bad paper discharges reversed, and they would then be able to access medical care, which is a super important thing to do, right? If you are injured, and PTSD is an injury, if you are injured in service to your country does in fact owe it to you to take care of you, because that's part of the promise. That's part of the deal. And that's why you take the crap pay, because you are supposed to then be taken care of later. So I was looking over this bill, and they sent it over to my office, and they said, hey, we want to see if your boss would co-sponsor, which means you essentially promised to vote yes. And it was my job to look over the bill and make a recommendation to Senator Markey. And I looked it over, and I remember just picking up the phone and calling over to Cory Booker's office, calling over to the staffer I said, hey, I just want to let you know this is a really cool idea. I'm really in support of it, but there are a couple of issues in the way that this bill is written. One, the time limit is wrong. First of all, you need to make sure that it's either 180 days from discharge or from notification that you're eligible for this, because there are a lot of people who would have been out too long to access this. But you also want to make sure that there's a window for people moving forward. And you have to have a notification requirement. The VA has to be required to notify everybody who's eligible. And I remember hearing on the other side of the phone, what do you mean I have to have a requirement? The VA will just do that. And I said, you're talking about thousands of people. This is like a huge amount of effort. You have to require it of them. And I just remember the dead silence on the other end of the phone and realizing, like, this is probably somebody who's 24, never served in the military, doesn't have any personal experience, has never dealt with the VA, doesn't understand that there are just thousands of people trying to process all of the paperwork, all of the admin, all of the things that are going on in the VA. What you're doing is giving them more work, and you have to legally require them to do it, or they're going to backburner it by necessity. And I just said, hey, I just wanted to give you a heads up. I'm going to recommend to my boss that we not co-sponsor unless those changes are made. But, it's your bill. You kind of have to, it's your choice, right? And they said, okay, thanks. Thanks for letting me know. And they called me back 5-10 minutes later and they said, hey, just a heads up, we've made those changes. And I remember sitting there going, holy shit. Like, remember Legally Blonde, the musical? I'm sorry, everybody. I am such a nerd.
I promise this is going to make sense.
No. There's a moment where in the musical, she saves the dog in the same way that she does in the movie. But there's a moment where Elle Woods stops and she sings. And I'm not going to sing because I love you. And I don't want your podcast to get banned. But she goes, is that law? Is that what law does? Like, I can save things, I can do things. And it was sort of the same feeling for me of that, just, holy shit, I just made a difference. Like, this bill passes, it will be functional because I understood something critical about the VA just because I'm in the damn thing. And like, VA, I know you're trying and it's okay. I'm with you. It's cool. You got a lot of work to do, but it's, they're trying. And part of the job of lawmakers is to try and facilitate that. Mm-hmm. But they don't always know, because it's not always people who have the inside information who are writing the laws. They're just trying to do their best. And that was when I started to realize that, like, personal experience and your sort of insider knowledge of any particular system becomes critical to doing the right thing.
Yeah. I think that that's so important. Obviously, that is a great story that just shows how one person actually can make a difference, especially if you sort of let yourself end up in the right place at the right time through a series of twists and turns. But I've seen that happen over and over and over in my own life, where some random thing that you don't necessarily think of as applicable to the work that you're doing in that moment will come up. And only because you have this unique background are you able to make a recommendation or say, actually, I'm not sure that will work. And actually, I remember, to sort of combine both of our interests and experiences, when I was in your class and my team's project was doing this veterans health bill, and we were doing medically tailored meals for veterans. And I remember thinking, like, okay, great. So we'll just, like, I don't know, have the VA like administer this. And you were like, wait a second.
No.
The VA is like a little busy. So what if you thought about it through this other lens where maybe a private company could be subcontracted to actually do the administration, and the VA would just like disseminate it, right? Like, they could just help contact the veterans, put them in touch. They could write the prescription, but not actually have to hand out the meals. And just that little note there of, like, the VA is busy. And if you write a bill that requires them to hire a staff of chefs, it's probably not going to happen. So maybe there's a company doing meals already who has the infrastructure in place. And I was like, oh, yeah, that makes total sense. And similarly, when I was working in the food as medicine space, there was some conversation, just even the ongoing talk. And I mentioned this recently on my episode where I discussed food as medicine. There's a lot of talk about produce prescriptions. And I'm for it, obviously. If healthcare wants to pay for produce and get medical dollars to farmers, like, let's make it happen. However, most people can't cook.
Right.
And even those who know how to cook often don't have time to cook. And even those who might seem to have some time to cook don't have a fully equipped kitchen or whatever, right? I love to cook. I used to be a professional chef, and it takes me hours a day to cook. It's a huge mess. It's a big commitment. So how is a produce prescription going to necessitate a compost prescription? Because people aren't going to actually cook, and we're going to need to get that all into the compost and not the landfill. How can we think about the complications, the things that could go wrong, the extra steps that are not being prescribed? And how can we be compassionate and realistic and say, of course, produce prescriptions, yes, but you better pair that with cooking classes.
Yeah.
Or you better drop ship them an Amazon box full of pots and pans and a knife, because otherwise they might not own those things, right? Or are they intermittently homeless? Like, if this person has a produce prescription because they're on Medicaid, do they have a kitchen, right? All of these layered issues that suddenly you realize no one issue lives in a vacuum. And if someone is chronically ill and food insecure, they might also not have a really good knife. And they're probably going to be really frustrated about chopping sweet potatoes with that dull knife. We've all done it. It's terrible. And so how can we help actually enable not just access, quote unquote, which is a really popular word, access, and accessibility is important, but not just access, enjoyment, utilization, benefit, because access is not benefit. Those are different things. And there's like a bridge in between them that involves a lot of work, which is not always available to people, even when you grant them access. So I love what you're saying, because you had this access knowledge.
Right.
You're like, wait a second, if you don't mandate this, it's not going to happen. Like, trust me, I've been to the VA. They don't have time for this. It's so important to have those lived experiences in the room. So thank you for sharing that and for doing that, because it's so important. And also just like inspiring to everyone and anyone listening who thinks like, well, how does like the 4 years that I spent as a camp counselor going to inform my work as a XYZ? Like, whatever it is, you never know, some moment where your random lived experience could just be the thing that saves the day.
Every cover letter I have ever written since I was 25 has said my very first job was as a translator, and I still do it. And yes, at this point, it's something that I've developed over the years. So it's like a pat thing that I say. But genuinely, the most important skill I've ever developed is understanding that everyone speaks in a slightly different language. And if you're not paying attention to the language that they're using and what they mean by it, you're on different pages.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it's something that I put in my cover letters and in my sort of statements and all that, to get people to be like, oh, ooh. But it's also very true, right? My husband is still active duty military. Good job, babe. He has lived his whole life in that world, and I have not been in that world in, I'm not sure I should admit how long, in a very long time, since 2007. And what is that? I can't math right now.
Well,
17 years.
Yeah, it's almost 20 years.
Yeah, it's almost 20 years. And so he speaks a slightly different language than I do, and he has as yet not had to apply for a job in 20 plus years, which must be so nice. But so we speak different languages and we have different professional approaches, because he has job security that I remember, but I don't have anymore. And so I have to be a little bit more careful, but I also have more freedom. And I also have more ability to be sort of more agile and flexible with what I'm doing. And he lives in a much more rigid and hierarchical world that has to function in the way it does. So I think the most important thing that we can do is recognize who are our allies. Like, you need to work with the agricultural field and the health field and the policy field. And there are 17 like industrial and logistical field, right? How do you get people these things if they're food insecure and they're disabled or homeless? Or how do you reach these people who are in the most need, as opposed to the people who are in the medium need that are much more easily reached? and maximize our impact. All of those things mean that you have to talk to all of those people, which means you have to learn 15 different languages, and you have to teach them yours too, so that they understand what you're talking about and why what you're doing is relevant to them. And I honestly think one of the most valuable skills that I have ever developed is the ability to take a step back, look at somebody and say, what is it you're wanting? What is your agenda here? And take their agenda and say, okay, let me put your agenda next to mine. Let's circle where they overlap. That's what we're going for. That's the progress we can make. Because you were talking earlier about like, how do you do the right thing when you don't know what the right thing is? The right thing is the best thing that you can do right now. That's the right thing. You can't fix any of these massive problems we work on in one day, 1 hour, one phone conversation. I had one phone conversation. I didn't fix the VA. I fixed one thing in one bill that made things slightly better. And I'm very proud of that.
As you should be.
Great moment of my life. But that's what we have to do. And that's what I think is incumbent on those of us that are trying to work in this space, is we don't get to be selfish because we're not working for ourselves. We have to find the best way forward. And that means taking a bunch of people who have different agendas, different goals, seeing where they align and saying, this is where we work right now, today, you and me, this is where we line up, this is where we work. And tomorrow I'm working with someone else and I have to ask them what they want too. And if you keep doing that, you find enough people that have similar enough goals that you can actually make a difference. And this isn't me being Pollyanna. In fact, I'm highly cynical and I usually try to figure out how to make people's selfishness work for me. But it is me being very pragmatic and saying, I can't make 100% solution work. I have never, not once in my life, made 100% solution work. I have gotten a 20 or 30% solution. And once we have the success of that, then we can build on it and we can do something more the year after and the year after that. And it's not as satisfying as just fixing everything, but it's actually doable. And that I'll take that 20%. I will take it.
Yeah. I also think, and this is my own lens that I kind of share with my children, is like, as a person who has chosen to bring other humans onto this planet, I feel on some level that I am acting selfishly when I work in the service of the common good, because I'm invested in society existing, because I put people here and I want them to live and prosper and be able to have clean water and food and a blue sky and air that they can breathe without a gas mask on and all of those luxury goods like fresh air and green plants, right? So like, I definitely agree that minute to minute, those of us who want to work in this space and want to advance progress, civilization, protection, help others, we can't really behave selfishly to optimize cooperation. But I also know in my heart that on some level, I am behaving selfishly because I have a selfish interest in my great, great, great grandchildren. You know, eating food. I'm just like really just seeing that for them. Clean water. So every day it's like this zoom in, zoom out. Like when I zoom all the way in, there's no real way for me to separate myself from society. Like even on our most selfish days, even when we feel like I did that all on my own, you know, you still drove on a road that somebody else paved, and you still, even in like me, I cook all my own meals. I didn't grow the food. I didn't
filter the water.
I didn't filter the water. I didn't make the pan. I didn't like plumb the gas line into, or is it called plumbing when it's gas? I don't know. I'm not a plumber or a gas installer. Obviously. But there's just so, like, we are all in this together, even in our most selfish moments. So anyway, it's like, it's always a combination of like, yeah, even if I am doing this for my own selfish gain, like it better benefit everybody else because I am in this with them.
Yeah.
So having said that, having said and acknowledged that everything is connected, when you look back over everything that you've done, which is a lot of things, right? You went here, you went there, you were in a war here, you were in a Congress office there, teaching, traveling, translating, all the T's. Do you see a thread, like looking backwards? Because you said earlier, like, you've never known what's next. You've always just kind of gone to the next thing, which is exciting. And obviously it's led you in a great direction, an interesting, fun, helpful direction. But when you look back at it, do you kind of go like, oh yeah, that all makes sense? Or do you feel like it has just unfolded in unpredictable ways? Like, is there a thread?
Both. Both is good. So in a way, when you look back on it, it makes sense, right? You can draw a through line, you can connect the dots. I started in as a soldier, defending people, trying to make the world a better place. And to some degree, I'm still doing that. I'm just doing it with a different enemy or different, sometimes it's the same enemy, right? Because I work in counter bioterror sometimes. But ultimately for me, I haven't at all talked about any of my mentors, which is me doing a horrible disservice to them. And it was just recently revealed to me through my family chat that my husband's family chat, my husband has 7 siblings, y'all.
Wow.
I have 3. And my family doesn't do like group chats. His family has multiple family, like I am constant. I have so many messages on my phone all the time. But it's sort of delightful to be part of a family that does that. But I found out that most of my husband's male side of the family have never had any mentors. And I don't think I could have gotten through. I mean, I got through the military sort of, kind of with, no, that's a lie. I had mentors in the military too. I have never gotten through a single stage of my life without a mentor. I, to this day, have mentors that I reach out to that are unbelievable people. And sometimes I still can't believe they give me the time of day. Dr. Fisher, Julie Fisher. She has been a mentor of mine for decade or more at this point. My undergrad professors all mentored me. I was able to change syllabi of my professors because I wanted different books on syllabi, or I wanted different projects to do. And they just sort of were bemused by me. Now that I'm a professor, I get it, right? Like, I have a student who's engaged. Why not? Let's see what happens. But I have had so many incredible mentors who have guided me and who have put me up for opportunities, who have I got into WHO because of a fellowship that a mentor of mine put in front of me, granted with 2 weeks notice. But I had been preparing for it my whole life. I just didn't know it. I didn't know it existed. The fact that I went into policy is only because a mentor of mine told me that I should do it. Her name is Marian. She's amazing. She's down at UGA. She's a veterinarian. And she straight up told me, you should do this. You would be suited for it. My master's capstone advisor, and I was her research assistant, Grace Bagwell Adams, really, really, really instilled in me a huge respect for the welfare system in the United States. That's what her research is on. And I had always been kind of an arrogant asshole. And I had always thought, like, that's not a thing that's interesting. I'm an idiot. Everything is interesting once you start learning enough about it. And I became super passionate about the policies and how we were doing them and whether or not they were actually working, because that was the research I got to do with her. Every single stage of my life has had multiple mentors. And I think finding those people and having them help me and being inspired by them is really the honest through line, right? My mom is the one that got me into the military. My mom is the one that found me a path forward, right? And everybody tends to put people on a path that they've been on. So having multiple mentors means that my path branches a lot because there are different people with different connections and different pathways that they have open. But I think, honestly, the through line is that I didn't do any of this by myself. I have always had people encouraging me, and I've always had people supporting me. I've always had people somehow telling me I'm personable, which is the weirdest compliment, but like, because I'm a spiteful asshole, right? I live my life in spite. But honestly, for me, it's recognizing that for anything that I could take credit for, I have to share that credit, because even in the Senate, Phil McGovern, if you ever hear this, you are the best mentor. And now I'm going to cry. Um, there's no job I've ever had where I haven't fucked up. And my mentors have always supported me and just been there for me and helped me fix it. And that's the other thing I think is also just recognizing, and this is the painful part, I am not perfect. I'm not actually great at everything that I do. And I don't have to be. I just have to be willing to get better. And I think that's the other part is like, I didn't ever wait until I was perfect at anything to just start, especially when I had mentors who were like, just try it. Just go try your best. Go get your master's. Go into policy. Go try to write a bill. Go try to do this. Just go do something. That's really, for me, the through line is I haven't done any of this alone. I've always had people who had my back, and I've always had people I could turn to for help. And if I did anything right, it was in choosing those people and finding those people. Yeah. And to all the mentors that I have, because I have many more that I did not specifically call out, you know who you are, and you know I love you.
That is beautiful. And I don't think that I could have known that I would want to end the conversation on that note, but I think I do because I think it brings together so many of the themes that we talked about, the kind of winding path, public service, everything's connected, and that we are all in this together.
Yeah.
And that even when you look back on your own achievements and you feel proud of those achievements, you also see the people who supported you in those moments, the times that were hard, the times that you didn't feel as proud of what you did, the times that someone said, that's okay that you fucked up, try again. And so I do kind of want to wrap up by just emphasizing the importance of mentorship and I think like vulnerability, because you have to be willing to ask someone or to be open to having a mentor, to being like, hey, I'm gonna try these new things and I'm a little bit nervous about it. Like, do you mind supporting and guiding me? And I've also had that experience as a person, and I think as a woman, like there have been times where I felt like, I don't know, like, is there a similar like woman out there doing powerful things? Like, is it weird? Like, what am I doing? And then I ended up at American University because their public health department, everybody running it was a mom.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I could go back to school. It wouldn't be weird. Like, these ladies all have 4 kids and they're rocking academia. Like, I
Yeah.
guess it's okay. And if I hadn't met them and seen that example, and if they hadn't literally said to me, like, you belong here, I might not have gone back to school. So it is so important to find those mentors and to allow them to shape you
Yeah.
and guide you. So thank you
Yeah.
for
And
sharing that.
I want to add one last thing. Men and boys deserve mentors too.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah.
There's a huge sort of stigma about doing it all yourself or asking for help or not knowing everything that I think actually makes women more likely to seek out mentorship and to seek out fellowship. Not to make a Tolkien pun, but it's especially people who've been in the military, you know, men and people who are non-binary and people of color and people who are white. Everybody deserves mentorship and needs mentorship. And it's okay to find those people. And it's okay if they don't check every single box, right? It's half of my mentors have been men. A lot of my mentors and a lot of the people I really look up to are women of color. I don't think anybody could find a more incredible role model than Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, who's currently State Department Undersecretary of, oh, you have to fact check me. I think, so she used to be the ambassador for global health security, and now she's the ambassador for, I think it's nuclear disarmament, maybe. She's on the AUKUS treaty and a lot of other things. Anyway, she's incredible. And has taken several hours out of her life to mentor me personally. Not recently. She's very busy right now. But I think being willing to look outside of sort of your own personal demographic is also really, really useful. And some, like, I, of course, having been mentored so much, I actively try to mentor myself, although I don't feel equal to the task. But I do have students come to me, and I do have other people come to me, and I try very hard to recognize the differences. So if you're white and I'm white, but we're both women, but recognizing that intersectionality and recognizing that if you're giving the same advice to a white guy as you are to a Black woman, you're probably doing both of them a disservice, right? And that's been another piece of it. Having such a diverse group of mentors makes you, I think, a better mentor, and at least makes it easier to recognize I don't have all the pieces, and I need to help you find other people who know what you're going through and who have a finer appreciation of what it's like to be in your shoes. But I've actually found incredible value in just recognizing those differences, and I have found students being so much more willing to work hard when you at least acknowledge, right? Acknowledge what's difficult. My name is Taylor. I grew up in the military as a young professional. You've gotten emails from me. I have a very straightforward and pretty masculine hand in an email. The number of times I walked into a congressional meeting where people were like, "Oh, you're a person."
They're like, thank you for being
here. This is not what I expected to be walking into the room to talk to me. I've benefited from male privilege in some ways simply because I have an androgynous name and because I have sort of what in Morse code would be called a male fist in my emails, a male voice in my emails. And that is something that I have to recognize when people come to me and say, so I'm writing emails to people. Great. Are you signing your name Marian Flaxman or M. Flaxman? Right? How are you doing that? Because it might make a difference. And if we're not willing to accept that and mentor that with other people and talk to them honestly, not about, you have to be pretty and thin and really smart and you have to wear these shoes. And no, that's not what it's about. But if we're not willing to be honest about what the climate that we're in, we're not helping and we're not being good mentors. And my mentors have all been very straightforward with me about that too. And I just think it's important to note that.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming and speaking with me today. I knew you already, but I learned a lot. And I think that so much of what you said is so important to so many issues that the world is tackling right now and that people are grappling with. So I just want to thank you for coming, for sharing this time with me, for sharing your story, and for all the wisdom that you dropped in this conversation. I know that many people will enjoy it and benefit from it, as I have.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to see you.
So good to see you. Thank you once again for listening to the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast, a podcast dedicated to reintroducing personal narratives into critical public health topics. For more information on me, Marian, please visit my website at marianflaxman.com. For more information on my guest, Dr. Taylor Winkleman, please find links in the show notes. This episode was produced by Brain Trust Productions and sponsored by Informed Solutions Consulting. Thank you so much once again for listening, and we will see you next time.